So this week was about silence. How did the reading go for everyone?
It's good.
How experienced are you with silence? Or are you like the first church where I pastored, where my job very often, because I was the associate pastor, my job would be to do the prayer, and I would do a time of silence, and I would literally count only to about 20. And some people would say, that's way too much. Way too long. Right? And we have a couple of prayers who also leave some silence in there. Mary often does that. Ed often does that. But silence can make us uncomfortable, can't it? It doesn't mean it's a bad thing, but it can leave us in that space of uncomfort.
What I was reminded of as I read through it, Jim, is that I have a lot of opportunities for silence now that I'm old. But when I was a young mother teaching school, I ached for moments of silence. It was like there aren't any to be had. It was so about having to find it was a reminiscence for me, having to go out. I would go for a ride in the car. I would step into the backyard, or actually what I did was I got up really early before everybody else got up so that I could have quiet.
So do you know what Judy's job was? I know you do, Nancy. She was a first grade teacher. And here's statistics about first grade teacher, about any teacher, but the lower in the grade levels, the more. Here's the typical amount of decisions somebody makes in a day. First grade teachers is here. It's just very high, and it's a continual just bam, 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 bam. And so literally there's not much room of silence. But all of our lives, if we're relatively responsible, have a lot of noise. Not bad noise, just a lot of noise in our life. And taking that space like Judy did to just have a breather is not a bad thing.
I was talking to Jim about how silence for me is almost like food. When I'm hungry, I need to eat. After a while, I need silence like I need food. And we had a guest for a week, a friend of mine from college, for a week at the house, and she left last night. And she's a lovely woman, everything, but it was a long week. It was sort of like, oh my gosh. And with her not being here this morning, it was like, oh, I can have my regular silence in the morning and not worry about getting her breakfast and coffee and then talking with her. And it was, and listening to her. It was like, oh, I haven't done that in a really long time, had someone in our space like that. So that was interesting. And I think this was a great chapter to end the whole book on. And in some ways it was 8 pages long. It was probably the shortest chapter, but it was the one that I, in a way, like the best. I guess I like the idea of listening to silence in meditation and asking for guidance, but just listening, waiting to hear. And, even on some of those, try this, what guidance do you hear? And sometimes it comes in a form like, be careful, or it might come as wait. And then you just listen to that. And I agree with Judy, like the older I am, the more silence I have, but the more I need. I'm 2 years out from retirement, but I've been busy doing other things. And I also think I needed it then when I was younger, but I seem like I need it even more now, even though I have more opportunities. I love the opportunities for silence. Do you feel that way, Susan? I know you're.
Yeah, I was just going to share that I was like, reminded me of that person that was in the chapter who always wanted the TV on, always wants the TV on, the radio on, the iPod in the ear. And I was like that for a long time. And I find in the last year that silence has really been a godsend for me, because I do agree with the book says, or what she's suggesting to be open to, and that is that God comes through and God talks to you, and be open to that, or whoever you call God. Because like you, I'm like, I not hear things, but I get feelings like, I figure out certain things or get better organization, like she shared in the book, figured out kind of what to do or how to feel about certain things when there's silence. But for me, because I have arthritis, when I don't have distractions and I get more into my body, I start feeling things that are painful. And so that's why I think for a lot of my life, I've wanted to have some sound to distract me. But I'm learning to go, work through that. And I see the benefit of silence more now than I ever did before, especially after reading the book.
Susan, I think you bring up a really good point. I think we all sabotage our own silence a lot, right? Because we've taught ourselves to turn on the TV as soon as you walk in the house, right? I want to give you two images that I think are important to help us understand why silence is important. One of them is just the notes at the beginning of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, the do 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 do. They would not be as powerful if there was not the silence between them, right? The silence between them lets each note speak strongly, right? And so we need that space between the noise. And it's not because the noise is wrong, but that silence allows the noise to be heard, each noise be heard clearer. But the second image I want to give us is the idea of just breathing. We know we have to inhale and exhale. If we only do one or only do the other, it does not help us, right? It's the duality of those two things and the interconnected of the nature of them that is important. And so you have to find silence in order to hear the noise better. You have to breathe in and breathe out. But let's go back to the sabotage. Why is it that you don't? What do you purposely put in your way? So like when I go on my runs, which is a very silent time for me in many ways, I often wear my ear pods and listen to music. It's not that I don't hear lots of things there, but it also makes it so that it's not just a silent event. How do you sabotage your silence?
Well, sabotage is kind of a negative term.
I know that. I know. That's why I'm using it on purpose, Nancy.
Okay. Well, on the positive side, for some people and myself, sometimes I like the company. If I'm going to have a meal, Mike's not around, I'll just turn on whatever and have the company and the noise of the voice, the human voice. Other times I don't. There's that Calm app that tells sleep stories, and I don't like to listen to it when I'm about to go to sleep because it's too much noise, even just a human voice. But I'll listen to it on a walk if it's a long walk, and then I'll listen to a 30-minute sleep story. I don't go to sleep, but I enjoy the story. But I understand the negativity using that word, Jim, sabotage, because when you need the silence and you choose to have whatever sound, it takes away the benefits of what the silence can provide you.
Right. And it's not that the other is wrong. Don't get me wrong. I think there's times when we need noise. It's just, do we recognize the need for silence as well? And that's what I mean by sabotage. If we're so busy listening, because for example, my ear pods, I listen, I use the music that I listen to a lot, and I hear lots of things in that music, right? I share it with you on a regular basis. It doesn't mean that's the only place of wisdom that there is. Is there wisdom in the things I'm passing that I'm missing because I'm busy listening to the noise in my ear pod?
Mhm.
Catherine, do you ever sabotage?
Oh, no, never.
Good morning, Catherine.
Good morning. I wanted to apologize for running late, and my dial or my connection was being pokey and I couldn't get into the meeting, and so that was a little frustrating, and I was trying to run an errand to get it out of the way early this morning. So good luck on that one. I accomplished it, but the time just gets frittered away. Sometimes I suppose that I do. I try to have silence because I find that I get too much, TV and too much anything is overstimulating, and I try not to look on the computer at night or after a certain hour, and I shut it down, and the same with my phone. And I always turn my phone off at night because I can't stand it making noises, or
Yeah.
I don't want to be talked. I don't want to talk to anybody after about probably 9 o'clock, if that. So, but I've tried to be listening, and I don't know if I sabotaged it or not, but I wasn't receiving much of anything, and it's a little dismaying, but oh well.
Well, I think phones are a really good example. I'm amazed how much we've allowed these tools to give people permission to invade our lives.
Mhm.
Now we've all done that on purpose, where we've kind of been in a meeting and we go, I got to get this, sorry, because we
Mhm.
want it out of the meeting, right? But that invades a lot, doesn't it? Just the noise of those phones and all the information and the good information it brings to us. But it also gives us permission for not being present in the moment.
Do you think that people like 100 years ago, because they had less sound supposedly than we do with the phones and so forth, do you think they were happier or less anxious than we are? I mean, that's a broad question.
Yeah, it was just different. Sometimes their noise was that they were having to work hard just to survive. But I look at my cowboy friends, and at least part of how when they did what they had to do to survive, sometimes it was long rides across following the cattle, it also gave them a space of relative silence to be in that space. And at the end, she gives two different objections that people raise up. And the second one was, I feel intimidated by silence. But the first one was, I can't find a quiet spot. And our space is often filled with noise. But they had things like looking out over a canyon, looking across a vista. When you live in a city, it's harder to find those kinds of spaces, isn't it?
And she mentioned the library a few times, and I just thought, libraries aren't quiet anymore.
Not the way they used to be, right?
No, they're not even, they're workspaces. They're changing. They're not that quiet space anymore.
Yeah. Well, and I got to tell you that when I went from layperson to pastor, the same thing happened to churches to me, right? Not that churches can't be a quiet space, but now they're a space of work. So if I come into church, I come and it's noisier for me. And I have to figure out how to very intentionally turn off the noise of, I got this task, I got that task. Mm-hmm. But we have to find those quiet spaces, don't we? A couple of years ago, Nancy and I went to Machu Picchu. And one of the reasons why I like Machu Picchu is because for me, I don't have to do the tour any longer. I can sit there and just be in a quiet space. And it's a good quiet space for me. It stills my soul.
That was 5 years ago, Jim.
Yeah, no, it's like crazy, huh? So where have you found quiet spaces for you?
Well, Zion behind me is my place. That's my
That's a good,
spiritual
that's a
place.
good quiet space.
And that's where I find the most peaceful and the most soulful quiet.
Uh-huh.
That's my Monte Picchu.
That's good.
Mm.
And having a picture like that helps. Another quiet space for me sits in the center of West Maui. It's called the Io Valley. And I keep a picture of it on my phone so that after that meeting, you know, that kind of meeting, or maybe during the middle of that meeting, I just look at the picture
Mhm.
and it stills my soul a little bit. And it gives me
The
some
tea
quiet.
times do that for me.
Good. Yeah.
I was just thinking, and this is a new thought after all these years. That sometimes it may be that when I haven't gifted myself with silence, that wakes me up at night and gives me that silence. I don't have many wakeful nights, but every once in a while I'll be awake in the middle of the night and I can't discern why. It's not necessarily one problem or anything, but it may have been that I haven't given myself quiet during the day, and my body or my spirit knows I need it. So I'm awake at night to explore that quiet. I don't know.
Yeah.
Judy, I like when you say gifted myself with silence. I like that phrase.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I gift myself with a lot of things.
But I think that may be part of why traditionally we look at older people and we see a wisdom there, is because there is a very either forced or intentional silence that enters, which allows us to be able to see things differently. And so that's a good gift for us to give to ourselves and to the world when it comes to that.
After I've meditated for 20 or 30 minutes, I have a calmness in my body that I didn't have when I started. I physically can feel a difference. And I think you're right. When you have that in your body, it is a gift to other people because it resonates. And the same is true with the opposite. You know, my friend that was here, she's really high energy woman. And I felt I had to put up like an emotional shield so that I wouldn't take on her frantic energy. And I don't do so well with that. It's like too much caffeine.
Yeah.
But if there is a drink, maybe chamomile tea that calms you down, I think that you become a better person to the people around you, because then they're not having to put up that shield against your negative vibe.
Yeah. Let me give you an image that might help you with that. And it goes off of the image that she has of Lily, her dog, right, who's barking all the time. Do you know why our dogs bark all the time in America? Because they're pack animals and we've isolated them.
Oh.
Okay, they're territorial animals, and so we've given them walls to say this is the end of your territory. If you go, okay, so a couple of years ago, well, if when Nancy and I went to Machu Picchu, it was 5 years ago. This was probably even longer than that. I took a team of youth down to San Luis, Mexico, and we built a house down there. And one of the girls was very interested in all the dogs that were all over the street. They were everywhere, right? And she said, why aren't they barking at each other? Because they're not hidden behind the walls of their territory. They're on neutral ground and they don't have to defend the spot that they are in charge of. And so much of our work is where we're defending our territory. We're doing what has to be done to get this done. And silence puts us into that space that's not our territory. And so maybe we can somehow stop the barking because of that. Does that make sense?
Interesting.
So could you run that by me again, Jim? I'm not sure I got it.
When we get out of the space of responsibility, right?
Okay.
Our dogs bark in order to tell the other animals, this is my space. Not necessarily in a mean way or bad way, but they're busy telling each other that.
Mhm.
Once you get them out of having to defend that territory, all those animals in San Luis just knew that this was everyone's space, right? How do we turn off all the to-dos, all the responsibilities, all the stuff that makes us not hear a different, not open up to a different voice? That's what we have to try to do. What's
So
causing?
you're saying that our distractions are talking, the noise is like a dog barking, and that the noise is actually defending our space. Is that what you're saying?
Either that, what I'm saying is that we've learned to make noise sometimes for a lot of different reasons. And maybe silence is what helps us to not have to listen to just what told us to make the noise.
So I'm thinking about my classroom all those years ago. And one of the things we worked toward, and often by the last 2 weeks of school, we were accomplishing it. Took a long time. But we'd have a silent reading time. And partly it was to do with how the kids could actually read, but partly it had to do with how comfortable they were with each other, that they didn't have to vie for attention, but allowed them to be quiet. And there were times even with 6-year-olds, that I was reluctant to say time's up, because they'd finally gotten to that space where everybody just seemed to be comfortable and quiet together. And I know that's the way for me with old friends. I don't have to fill all the space with my voice. I'm content with quiet between us, because there's nothing to be resolved, I think.
Yeah.
In hindsight, it feels like that same thing, that kids, when they come in, are unconsciously vying for attention and for their place in the hierarchy of the classroom.
And isn't that at least part of what we're doing in all our madness around our jobs and everything? We're vying for our space of.
And we might want to watch that with newcomers to church too. I think there are some people who come in and feel like they have to make a splash somehow to be part of the community. And others that we may be guilty of not noticing, because they don't make a lot of noise.
Yeah.
I'm talking off the top of my head. It may not make any sense. I'm sorry.
Well, I think what we're talking about when we're listening to silence is what's the unknown for all of us. So trying to make sense of it off the top of your head is sometimes as good as, I think it just takes some time. I don't think anybody understands it perfectly, do we? But I know where silence has helped me. The spaces where I've calmed down enough that I've listened to it. Where I've heard. I liked what she talked about, how if you try to turn off one sense, that you have the other senses that get heightened. And I think that's what we're trying to do in silence. When I essentially turn off my ears, how else am I hearing? If I'm used to just pulling in auditory signals. What am I not hearing? What am I not sensing? And I think that's what we're trying to do with silence, isn't it?
I was going to tag on to what Judy said. With the kids that are talkative, they need to make the splash. They need the attention. Do you think they need love? That attention is a deficit for love. And maybe when we stop the noise, also stop our own talking internally and externally. And in that silence, I realize I am already loved. I don't need to prove it to anybody, certainly not to the creator. If I'm created, then I'm part of that God spirit. I don't know where I'm going with this either, Judy. Just, but
I think you're going right along what this whole chapter is trying to talk about. How do we hear differently? Because we do a lot of like a baby child, we do a lot of crying out for mama.
That's a good way to put it.
To recognize that mama is there. Right?
Mama's there, yeah. And maybe that's when you feel relaxed, is once you're entering that silence for a while, then maybe you feel that love and that relaxes you. You don't need to cry out so much.
Well,
I mean, there is a time to cry out. There's a cry, you need food or you need help, but then there's also a time maybe you don't need to do that. And that's really welcoming. Catherine, what it looks like you're thinking. Like,
All the time.
and
Well,
I like your haircut. Your haircut's cute.
Thank you. Thank you. I have a good guy, and I had to get to see him because I was wanting to get scissors in my hands, and I know better. So thanks. Well, two things. First of all, sometimes one sense needs to override another. So what do I mean by that is that I have a peculiar habit that's longstanding, and sometimes I want to share it with people so they don't think I'm being rude. But when I'm thinking hard, now I can just like raise or lower my head, but sometimes I shut my eyes, and that can be kind of a weird habit in the presence of other people because they might think I'm being rude. But sometimes when I'm thinking hard, I just need to lessen the sensory input that's coming into me, and I do need silence because I tend to can get really scattered with too much coming at me visually, hearing wise, etc. So it strikes me that sometimes when I just go outside, I have chimes for one thing, and sometimes people might find them annoying, but actually they're soothing. And the other thing is just when I go water my plants and prune them a little bit, that's when it's just quiet. I have quiet. So there's quiet, there's periods of quiet in the daytime and necessary for sure.
Catherine, I'm like you. I'm a chime lover, and I have chimes in my garden too. And but I don't see them as noise. I just, they kind of help with the meditative process for me. But I know some people may not like them, but for me, they are very, very soothing and meditative too.
And quiet doesn't mean necessarily a cessation of noise. It's quieting something so that you hear something else.
That's a good point.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's excellent.
Could you give an example, Jim, to add to your point?
So, for example, Bible study. Bible study is a good thing, but if you're so busy reading a whole lot of, you don't take one verse and just let that verse sit and rest and speak to you. So sometimes what we have to do is not study a lot. We need to just let one thing speak.
Mm.
And so when you have a chime, suddenly you're letting that one sharp noise be there and present, which draws you into a different space than all the other noises that are there.
Mhm.
Jim, what do you do when you have had a bad experience and it keeps coming back to you during that silent period? So the silence is not helpful, but that experience comes up and it's like, oh, that again? It's like PTSD kind of thing.
Good question.
Can you give us your wisdom?
Here's what I hear is the best thing to do in meditation. It's not to stop that kind of thing. You acknowledge it and you let it go.
Mhm.
You acknowledge it again and let it go.
Mhm.
You hear that it's there, but you also don't give it a place that makes it stop there.
That's what I do with my pain. I think, okay, my ankle hurts, and I acknowledge it, and then I just let it go.
Uh-huh.
Back hurts, So
Uh-huh.
that's what I do with the physical pain.
Yeah, that's right.
Some days it helps. Some days that's work. Some days it doesn't.
Yeah. And sometimes it's just, you know, say, I'll deal with that in 10 minutes, right?
That's true.
Because a pain doesn't necessarily need to be ignored forever. But you do need to say, I'm listening to something else right now.
Or could you add a mantra to kind of override that voice, that negative thing,
You can.
and say it over, all is well, and
Yeah.
picking up the arm from the record player.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And the letting go is easy to say, but sometimes hard to achieve.
Sure.
And maybe a mantra is something else that would kind of force it. I have a visual that a man going, stop, like, don't think that, stop. And that sometimes helps too. So like a visual or an auditory thing, or even moving to another place.
Yeah. And the hard part about mantras, because I like mantras because they often bring us into different spaces, but sometimes you're so busy, you can become so busy focused on just those words that all you hear are just the 3 words you're mantraing, or whatever it is. And so you want to make sure that doesn't happen, that the mantra definitely pulls you into a space of hearing more than just those words. If that makes sense. There's no perfect way to do silence, because guess what? In the most silent places you can find, you'll hear noises, right? Either within you or around you. The question is, are those noises that are going to draw you into a new space, a different space than what you were doing before that silence, or are they noises that distract you from hearing?
Would this be a good time, and maybe it isn't, just to have you reflect on the whole book? Like, what did you get out of this book? Because I know for myself, it has raised my awareness of listening. And I sometimes I'm with people that I wish would have read the book because they need to be better listeners. But we'll sidetrack there. But what have y'all gotten out of this book? Judy?
Well, actually, not much of it was was new information. I think listening beyond the veil was a new idea to me, although I think it's happened for me a lot, maybe not a lot, but enough. But I hadn't verbalized it in that way. But it was such a good and gentle reminder of so many things. I've taken as a professional, took lots of classes in active listening and all that kind of stuff. And so much of what she said, I knew, but in this time of being so separate, it was easy to forget what I knew, you know, and I don't want to do that going back into, I don't know if reality is the right word, but into closer interactions. The reminder to be a listener is really important. And so I really treasured that. And the time to reflect on that kind of idea with other people is always precious to me. Just because I think each of us brings so much to a different, like a facet of a diamond. We see things a bit differently, and it enhances how I see things. But it you know, it was a good refresher.
The hard part about that is that what you're saying is that we all should have learned it already, because we've all heard it before.
Well, wouldn't that be nice?
But you're exactly right. Marjorie Thompson says something along the lines of, when it comes to the spiritual life, we are all beginners, perpetual beginners. And so we do keep coming back to the very same types of things with subtle differences because of the situation we find ourselves in right now, the people that we're with, the age that we are. All of those things makes us hear this moment differently than a moment a few minutes beforehand.
What was her name, Jim? Marjorie
Thompson. If you haven't heard of her, she's a really good spiritual guide. She has some really good things that she does.
So is there a book, or I just Google her?
Yeah, if you Google her, you'll see quite a number of things that she's done.
Marjorie Thompson. Okay.
She was probably on my mind because she does do some of those companions in Christ. That's part of her work, is that. So probably came because of that is why I remembered her.
I understand what you're saying about how we're all new with our spiritual life and being, but I would have to add to that my spiritual life, like just my life, is different than when I was a teenager. You know, my spiritual life then was very different than now, and probably it will be different in 10 years. So I think we're new, but we're new to each season.
That's right.
Of our spiritual life.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And frankly, that's not a bad thing, because the last thing you want to do is treat your 12-year-old self in the same way that you treated your 8-year-old self. Your 12-year-old self needs different things and needs to hear life differently. And, you know, in the same way that you as a parent needed to treat your 8-year-old daughter differently than your 12-year-old daughter. If you try to treat them the same way, you will fail as a parent, right? And same thing with yourself. You have to treat yourself according to the space and the age and the person that you are today, not the one you were a few years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And that takes listening to the very same questions with a new ear.
Even the pandemic puts us in a new place.
I think one of the interesting things about this year is that this has been a year of silence, and that is part of why we've hated it so much. Right? All these typical ways we've had of interacting with the world have been shut down. And suddenly we've had to listen to silence. in a way that we didn't before, because we filled it up with going out to eat. We filled it up with going to the movies. We filled it up with, and this year we haven't been able to in the same way, have we?
Mhm.
So just like with our personal lives, we've hated the silence. But have you learned something this year?
Mhm.
What have you learned, Susan?
Oh, well, just with this book, I was gonna follow up with what Judy said, that I'm a trained counselor, so I've done a lot of, a lot of courses on active listening and so forth. But what this book taught me, or reminded me and taught me, was the idea that it's the internal listening. It's the external, but then turning it into the internal that that makes it powerful for me. It's not just the external.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like I was telling Nancy, that I'm really grateful for, in some ways, for the opportunity to, have the silence within the world with COVID. I mean, COVID's terrible. I'm not saying that. It's just that it's given me the opportunity to learn more and do things that I would not otherwise do. And I was telling Nancy that I kind of call it COVID University, because it's allowed me to explore things that I wouldn't have time to explore, and I would be distracted otherwise by doing things with my friends and just other things. I wouldn't be probably in the Zoom class, for instance. I would never have found you if it wasn't for COVID.
And Susan, I got to tell you that that's been one of my big listenings this year, is just right away, I realized there were people who we were not hearing as a church,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
And suddenly we corporately needed to listen differently than what we did before this time.
That's
and
a big lesson.
And it needs to change us, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, then that was worth it.
That was worth it. That's right.
I think it's just been a transformative time, and I think with each book study, especially through St. Francis, it's transformed me in a whole different way.
Mm-hmm.
And so, just like this book, that's what it's. So, thank you for the question, Nancy. What this book's meant, because that's what this book's meant to me. It's the internal listening is probably more important than the external listening for me.
Yeah, good. I hope everyone has realized that there's still something to hear. Something different than what you've heard before. One of the worst parts about my job is that my job in some ways is to be an expert and to give everyone my wisdom, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's a dangerous place to be in, because you think that you're always supposed to be the person of wisdom and expertise. And too many of us have that same tendency, don't we?
Mm-hmm.
And at least part of what listening is about, what this whole pathway is about saying, there's voices that can teach me. But you have to be very deliberate and intentional to hear those voices, don't you?
And that it is a path. I like that's part of the title.
Yeah.
That it's like the yellow brick road. We're not to the wizard yet. we're meeting all these people along the way to help us.
Nice.
And also to there's obstacles on a path. The poppies that put them to sleep, the flying monkeys, all of those things. I haven't encountered any flying monkeys lately, but it could be down the path. You just never know. I do have a very talkative dog, which is.
But think about those two images that you just said. The poppies affected certain people, but not others.
Mhm.
where the flying monkeys affected certain people and not others. And so what we have to do is say, whatever defeats the poppies isn't necessarily the issue of the flying monkeys. Does that make sense?
Well,
And
one puts you asleep and the other one attacks you.
that's
And
right.
and I can think about experiences in my life where I've gone to sleep when I should have been awake. And then there have been a few people that have been attackers, not physically, well, not physically really, but they're out there to get you, kind of thing. And you do need to be aware, you do need to have your guard up, but you need to be listening to the guard.
You have to hear what this situation is really saying to you.
Yeah.
And if you're acting as if it's still the poppy field, then you're not going to hear this in the same way. Right?
Jim, what did you get out of the book?
I in this particular class, I learned that there's 4 incredibly important women to listen to in my life. And I mean that seriously, that the voices of who you are enhance how I can view the world.
Wow.
Good answer.
We'll sign up for another class.
Okay, that's good. You know, all of us have all these things that are important to us, and slowing down and listening to both ourselves and the people around us is always enhancing. We sometimes just don't know it. And like she said at one point, she said, our thoughts race.
Mhm.
And so we hear all that racing thought. And sometimes that muffles incredibly wise voices around us.
I wanted to say that I've been thinking about this question as listening to everybody and being in agreement, and also for myself realizing that it's important to be comfortable and to not know and sit with not knowing,
Mm.
because I have a tendency to want to know and explain everything.
Mm-hmm.
However, I don't always have enough information. And so I think the book for me is about listening and waiting and not making up stories, but almost I want to say, wait and see, wait and hear, just wait sometimes. Don't jump to a conclusion that makes me a victim for one thing, or, puts me at odds. So to me, that's a very important thing.
And I think that's why she told the story about her one friend who said that he felt intimidated by the silence, and it was foreign, it made him nervous. But he also said this one, but it was also interesting. And we get past whatever the nervousness is in order to get to the interesting, to open ourselves up to the interesting.
Catherine, thank you for that observation about being able to, I wrote it down, sit with not knowing.
Yeah.
Boy, I like that. And
Yeah.
that is a tough one because you want control.
Yep.
Because control is sometimes a fake security.
Yeah.
But if you let go of the control and maybe embrace not the control, that you're like, what's around the river bend, you don't know, and that's exciting, hopefully. But that's hard to let go of the control and wanting to know.
Yeah.
And so to sit there and not know and be okay with that, that's a wonderful example of a healthy spirit, a mature spiritual person, I think.
Well, I think the question is, where do we find peace?
Mhm.
Where is peace found?
And your answer is what? Where is it found in you, for you?
Just waiting and seeing, not scrambling around, just sitting, being still, to be still.
That takes a lot of patience, though.
And I'm not known for my patience.
I don't think there's much in America that trains us to be patient.
Yeah,
We're,
you gotta
we're
work on it. You gotta
we're-
really work on it.
yeah, we're a pretty immediate society,
Mhm.
and maybe that's where our ancestors, who we were talking about earlier, had the advantage of it, that they didn't get necessarily things today. If they wanted a pumpkin, they couldn't just go to Safeway and buy it.
Mhm.
They had to plant the seed and wait.
But I've also thought that our ancestors were the restless ones. You
Mhm.
know, the year I spent in England, I was so aware that there were, it wasn't a group because it wasn't connected necessarily, but there were people who were committed to staying in the same place come hell or high water.
Mhm.
And the people who were unable to sit with that are the ones who came here
Mhm.
in a
Mhm.
lot of cases. And so they brought with them a restless spirit, I think. And not that that's bad necessarily. It's good for finding new things and exploring things, but it also is something that we need to balance with the quiet.
I think at least part of what I've learned to listen to, not hear all the time, but at least try to listen to, was all the things that I define as this is just me. The things that say this is just maps. And at least part of what I've had to hear is it still serving me? Or is that something I need to do differently? And that's at least part of what listening to silence is, isn't it? The good news is that we don't have to solve all of listening, do we? How many know you have at least a chapter or two to read about listening?
Mm.
Something more to learn. These 6 weeks have been marvelous for me. Thank you for your conversation, for your openness, for your sharing. I look forward to seeing you in the next class. Any last words before we go?
Well, thank you, Jim, for your wisdom. And I think when I have those quiet times in the morning, I will think of all of you.
Oh,
And hopefully you will think of me. And I'll see you all in the next class.
great. Yeah.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah.
Thank
Thanks
you.
to each one of you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Take care, my friends.
Take care.
Bye.
Stay.